Thank you for coming to my talk. I know you had a lot of choices today, and I'm glad you came here. Facebook and BuzzFeed have taught you well to show up to the most clickbait title, so I'm happy it worked. Well done. No, actually, I have a lot of good content. I hope you find some of it valuable, and let's get going. So I'm Ramin. I work at Twitter. We run a fairly large system. I'm allowed to say we have, what am I allowed to say, several tens of thousands of servers. And we generally measure Puppet as far as on the master side and the number of thousands of cores running it. So reasonably good size, and I've been a Puppet user since about 2010. I've run at a few companies in the past, everything from about Puppet 2.4 or 0.24 back in the day, and unfortunately we're still on Puppet 3 at Twitter with some Puppet 4 kind of floating around. And you may have seen me on IRC and Slack and on ask.puppet, so hopefully I've helped answer one of your questions one of these years. And kind of want to let you do the architect thing. Who here actually has architect in their title? Anybody? I see like 3. Cool, you should give this talk. Really, I'm just winging it. I don't have architect in my title. There's not a secret architect bathroom I have the keys to at Twitter. Like generally, it's just sort of a de facto thing. And generally, if you're guiding an internal technology, you're probably an architect. And what I like to call is, like, I like to say little a architect, not big A architect. Like, if you're the final escalation for something, you're probably the architect of it. And you know, how we can quibble about the word architect and what that actually means, but honestly, if you own that technology, you probably control its future. You generally have opinions on how it's used. You do a lot of influencing on whether there's 1,000 people you work with or 2. And you know, like you can be the architect of Kerberos or that person who knows how to make the Yum repos work when they stopped syncing. You can be the architect of Puppet. And generally, I kind of want this to be a little bit of a general talk, not specifically about Puppet itself, but how to kind of guide a technology within a company. And I'm using the only thing I'm really good at an architecture level, which is Puppet. Cool. A little nervous. And because I'm kind of the final escalation person at Twitter, I feel confident in saying, okay, I'm little a architect, sort of in control. So I mean, I've planned our upgrade from 2 to 3, in the process of running our upgrade from 3 to 4. If things were to catastrophically fail, my phone would blow up, people would call me, there might even be a telegram or 2. So I mean, like, to me, that says you own it. And if you own something at your company, then congratulations, you're an architect. So what does architect failure look like? Because that's really kind of what I'm worried about, because I kind of stumbled into this situation where we actually had sort of an architecture failure. There were no less than 5 secret projects, not so secret, to replace Puppet at Twitter when I got there. You know, people were actually kind of angry because it wasn't working well. And you know, Puppet certainly has its warts, but not enough to cause like this active rebellion we were seeing. There was a lot of myths and hearsay about how Puppet worked. I would find code all the time that says, Puppet doesn't know how to do RPM resolution. And I'm like, well, that's true, because it calls Yum. So I don't know what you're trying to do in this code, but you didn't understand the system you were in. And like the really weird code just gets odd. I mean, especially if you don't have somebody that kind of understands how Puppet generally works, like lots of parse order dependency weirdness, you dynamic variables specifically in like Puppet 2 and 3, you know, where you're like, okay, I'd set this variable here and I wouldn't be able to get it there because there's a different path, that kind of stuff. And like people were doing really weird contortions just because nobody really fundamentally understood the system. This is what success looks like. And I love this because it's like, this server doesn't run Puppet. It is useless to me. Like that's great. Like that's success of like, I don't even want to deal with it. It doesn't have Puppet. I'm like, great. Like, and this is somebody on my team of just like, these are nightmare hosts. I'm like, brilliant. Like, we're like, this is after 2 years of work. Like, we're succeeding. People want Puppet. They see it as a valuable member of the ecosystem internal to the company. And they're just like, stuff works. Puppet's running, I know like I'm gonna get something that's stable in a reasonable state, it's not gonna be scary. And I'm actually, there's been a couple of things floating on Twitter where people are like, I don't care how many 9s you have, I want happy users. And I think that's actually kind of where this is going. You know, like Puppet can actually, you know, have some failures, it's occasionally cost some sevs for us, but overall, like users are happy with it now and they are able to get what they want out of it. And how do we create this success? Mostly by solving the user's problems. If you stop solving the user's problems, they stop talking to you. And that's generally where people are going like their own way. They start losing touch with kind of the experts within the system. They start writing some odd code, and they're kind of off on their own sort of evolutionary dead end. Tweeting about this, well, there is a ton of it in these slides. It's mostly optional. I encourage you to tweet, because you know. All right. Oh, we got some mini rants, so this is like getting 4 talks for the price of 1. Because I work at a big system, people often like, oh, scale. So you know things. I'm like, well, I have a large system that works and isn't going to fall over next week. And this doesn't mean it's efficient, correct, optimal, maintainable, operable. It just means it's big. So I don't want you going like, hey, that dude at Twitter said to do it this way, so we're totally going to do it that way now. Like, don't do that. Like, I mean, a lot of what this talk is about is doing the right thing for your users in your system and how your business operates. So like, please don't take this and blindly cargo cult a bunch of terrible things. I told you not to. Getting work done is going to be messy. Part of the frustration for me, coming from a slightly smaller system, was I got to kind of do whatever I wanted. I actually didn't have to deal with that many technologies. Like, it was a fairly nice little startup stack. And I could kind of be a little bit more exact. In a much bigger system, things are going to be much messier. Like, you're going to go, I want it this way, and then you're going to realize I don't have 3 cases of this, I have 400 cases. So you're really going to have to be a lot more flexible with your users, and that's okay. And your job is to kind of help them through this process. And one of the things we talk about at Twitter is people were settling for the config they could get instead of the config they wanted. And part of you is to help them get to that config they actually want. Actually, I'm going to start my timer because I feel like I'm going very fast. One of the things I like is a therapist as a model. I always had an idea, especially 20 years ago, early in my career, that one day I was going to have control of the system and people were going to have to do what I said. And it was going to be great because I'm a smart guy and I'm going to tell them how to do it. And it's really not true. What I have come to realize is it's really more collaborative instead of authoritarian. I like to think of people like physical therapists or marriage counselors. If you come into a room and you're going to go, okay, what are you trying to accomplish? How do I help you get there? And your situation is going to be somewhat unique and it's going to be different from somebody else. And a lot of times you have to agree on the language. And learn really how to talk to. I went to physical therapy recently for my shoulder, and it was an interesting process because shoulder is very, very complicated. And I would describe something, and my physical therapist would say, okay, I understand the words, but I know what you mean. And it took us a while to develop a language where I could give her the feedback she was looking for, and then she could develop the technique I needed to do to get my shoulder back into place. And it was really an iterative process that took several weeks over the course of months to get to this point where we could build this feedback loop of what I was explaining, and she could use her knowledge to help me get to where I wanted to go. And just, to finish the story, don't sit like this all day. And then this job as architect is a lot about providing expertise, and you will also provide opinion. Like most people, you will totally give your opinion at the drop of a hat. I will totally tell you how to name your variables, what style to use, whether you should put a line after the if statement and before the next action, or vice versa. I will totally do it if you let me. But when I do that, I should say, this is how I prefer to do it. Nobody else cares about this other than me. Because when you start giving your users opinion disguised as expertise, you open up to this, they're going to find you useless after a while. You're going to be like the after-school special that, little Bobby and his friends, they went, they played on the train, and terrible things happened to them. And in real life, Bobby and his friends go to the train, and nothing happens, and then they start ignoring warnings, and eventually, something happens because they really ignored this because you oversold the consequences. So I can certainly tell people, hey, your code's a little easier if you write it this way. We like this sort of variables. It's in our style guide. If you could follow the style guide, that'd be great. But I try and make it mostly optional. So we're not, telling people you must do this, or we won't support you. You must do this, or your service will blow up and you'll have SEVs. When it's really not the case. Expertise, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Expertise is something that's what they're really coming for, and you need to be precise about it. I love the fact that all the Puppet code is online. And I often, like on a daily basis, weekly, say, hey, like this GitHub link with these line numbers, this is how the code actually works. That's the version we're running in production. You can match it to the branch on GitHub, blah, 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 blah. This is exactly the code we have, so this is exactly how it works. And it's fantastic. Like we used to have lots of arguments on our team, even the team that supported Puppet, before we like started doing this of like, you must quote upstream, you must like have a test case, you must have a doc. And it really kind of made the team a lot nicer to each other because like you weren't arguing opinion anymore. You were like, no, here's the code. Here's like what upstream said. And some of us has even gone so far, like in order to like, demonstrate things internally, like I've opened tickets to get documents created because it wasn't clear enough. I'm like, hey, we're having this argument. Can you just update docs? And Puppet's like, yeah, that'd be cool. Like, can you write it up, make a ticket? I'm like, sure. So like, and all of a sudden it's one less thing to argue about. And you can totally do that too. The other thing is experience is fleeting. I was at the Puppet Contributor Summit yesterday. Who actually went to the Puppet Contributor Summit? Okay, fair number. It was great. I ended up sitting at a table with Heinrich. We ended up talking about Hira. I explained a little bit of, hey, I'm moving like my Hira to lookup and and I'm like, this is what I'm thinking. And he's like, oh, no, you don't want to do that at all. And really, like, within 5 minutes, he had told me I was wrong, which was cool. And then we spent another 5 minutes, and then he told me how to do it correctly and how I was going to be able to give it to my users with the most amount of flexibility without really increasing the complexity. And my initial version was very sort of dictatorial. It was like, okay, this is how lookups are going to work. Whereas what he gave me was something of like, hey, you can influence the lookups at the data level. Do it that way. That gives you a lot more complexity or a lot more flexibility at the edges, and that's really what you want. And it was fantastic, and that's one of the reasons we interact with the community as much. I know if a couple of my coworkers are over there at PuppetConf. A few of us have spoken at various Puppet camps and meetups and PuppetConf last year. So by interacting with the community, we keep that level of expertise up internally, and it's super important. As soon as you stop kind of interacting with the community, your level of expertise starts decaying. And actually Puppet announced a bunch of things this week, so now I gotta go look at Bolt and like how's all this other stuff and decide, if users wanna use it or if we have a use case for it, like somebody actually needs to know something about it. And not to pick on Heinrich again, but a couple weeks ago he answered one of my questions on Ask, where I was having a very complicated problem with what undef is doing in Puppet 3 with the future parser turned on, and it was great that you have access to like these experts in these areas. Pretty much for free. And if you ever ask a question on ask.puppet, I'm number 2 in answers, so ask away. And that was actually kind of good because like it was great. We had this body of knowledge that I'd been writing at the last 3 companies, kind of ready to go on some of Puppet's sites. Expertise is also going to be a lot of work sometimes. You're just going to have to track down weird stuff. Generally, like if you're enough of an expert at a team, it's going to take you less time than anybody else to figure it out. And you're going to have to make that calculation within the company of, if there's only 2 of you, you're like, you should probably be an expert at Puppet 2. Maybe you should figure this one out. If there's, 50 of you, you're like, okay, you guys are experts. You're going to go figure out what the hell Ruby's doing. And like that sort of trade-off is going to happen. Ideally, you want to bring people in, but honestly, unless you're bringing an engineer specifically onto your team for a particular technology, they're just not going to get that deep. And I don't really see any answer around that, but I'm certainly willing to entertain it. And definitely feel free to come and talk to me afterwards about how you're doing it, or what you liked or didn't like about the talk, or what you think you're doing better, or even just talk through a couple of things. That'd be awesome. I was actually, John Allspaw posted a link to the Stella report, which is just stella.report, which is very confusing, but actually pulls up the PDF. And this is like sitting right at the top of it. And it was really just kind of fantastic. It was one of those things you sort of innately understood, but like then you read it, you're like, now you explicitly understood. And then as the complexity of your system grows, you know less about it. And I mean, that totally makes sense. Like I know a lot about Puppet and nobody else in the company does because they know a lot about jQuery or they know a lot about Node or MySQL or Hadoop or whatever else we use. And this really kind of explains, and D.D. Woods, he wrote the Human Factor. He's co-authored some papers with Sidney Dekker from Drift into Failure and Eric Hofnagel. So generally kind of in that human factor safety area. Written some really interesting things, so if you ever read anything else by him, I highly recommend it. And this gives us a clue to kind of what the job of the architect is. And that leads to this. My slides. Your users are going to want to do as little as possible. They're not going to be experts. And you have to be OK with that. I think early on, a lot of the code I inherited had assumed you were going to understand Puppet, and you were going to tweak your values to get exactly what you want. And really, it wasn't the case. And this was sort of a bad set of APIs, bad set of interfaces. They just required a ridiculous amount of context. And that is your job as architect, is to reduce the context. Context is, what's a good way? You'll have to know too much, and your users will not do it. And you will be constantly disappointed that they didn't interact with you more, they didn't write better code, and I just don't see any way to do it. I do like that Puppet 4 is going to make it easier to write better code. You'll be able to do a lot more validation on the way in. You'll be able to set which data types, what data you can add in. All of these things will make it easier for the user to know what you want. But even that is providing context clues along the way. So overall, you're still reducing the amount of context. And I think that's generally good for all the users. The other thing we do is we do a lot of detailed cookbooks. I tend to point people to examples that they could cargo call to do this, add your values in, you'll be fine. We write a lot of interfaces and APIs for people. Generally, when somebody brings a new technology, it's kind of worth our time to sit down with them and go, okay, what are you really trying to do? How can Puppet help you with that? One of the ways we talk about writing interfaces is the 90%. Okay, your first case should handle 90% of the cases, the second case 10%. And then if you really know what you're doing or want to test something, you should be able to throw values in via a dictionary or hash array, hybrid data, whatever you want to do. But generally, most of our users are looking for something simpler than that. They really want the main case, I'm going to set a package, I'm going to symlink it, I'm going to have it trigger a thing. They really don't care about kind of building these complex cases. What we do as a team is we'll often come in and talk with them about, okay, your cases are actually too simple. It's not actually working well for the way you're managing this daemon. What can we do to kind of help you manage your daemon better? Do you want a more complex interaction? Do you want to make decisions on whether to reload or restart? A lot of times we're giving the users didn't know that they could do any of this in Puppet, so we tend to come in and kind of give them their options or explain a couple of use cases. Often the users will be able to prototype their own code. It's sort of mix and match within Twitter itself. Within the repo, we have about 150 people committing on a rolling 90-day average, which is a fair amount, and it's just been rather impossible to bring everybody up to a reasonable amount of speed. We've tried the learning VM, we've given a few classes, but really unless you're committing regularly, it tends not to be very useful for most people. Most of the time we see, okay, I know how to add vhosts, I can do that. Cool. Mini rant number 2. If you don't know what to do, ship some code. How many people like this so far? I'm going to explain it, but how many people don't like this? No. All right, okay, this seems like a shipping room. One of the things I don't like is people come to you and they're like, what should we do? We have this problem. And you're like, I don't know. So we're not going to do anything because I don't know, because I'm the architect. And that's a terrible thing to do to your users. And you're not going to learn anything. We have shipped some terrible code as an experiment. And we've made some decisions. Sometimes the experiment's more like production. And we learn faster and harder. But that's OK as long as you're making a reasonable trade-off. And honestly, like if somebody is going to push something terrible to code, it should probably be me and the rest of the people I work with. I probably, hopefully, know when to make a reasonable trade-off. I know when to like pay the price for some tech debt in regards to Puppet, and where maybe we like, yeah, let's try this. Also, I can give clues to my users of, hey, we're going to put you on something experimental. Give us some feedback. We may change this on you later. Giving people the signaling up front and letting them know this is temporary, or I'm going to solve part of your problem this week and part of your problem next week. Let's see how it goes, and starting kind of that feedback iteration cycle really helps. And people, I've been surprised a lot of times somebody comes to me with something complex, and I assume I'm on the hook to solve that problem in the next 30 minutes. And really, you're like, hey, I don't really understand this. I want to write a couple of test cases and try them out. Do you have like a test cluster I can put some stuff on? And immediately the conversation is like, oh yeah, we just had questions, and yeah, next week is fine. And you're like, oh, okay, next week, great. Most of the time I do it that day, otherwise I'll forget. But it was like, oh, you guys, have some time. I don't need to solve your problem immediately. And then most people really want a better solution overall than they want an immediate solution. And as long as you're working towards their ends, they're pretty happy. One of the other things we do a lot of is office hours. And office hours are the best. I really enjoy them now. The first office hours I did, I kind of came in, I'm like, I'm going to bask in my users' love for me. That define you did? Mwah. That did not happen. We wrote a bunch of code. We did a lot of cleanup. It was good stuff. And we made the system easier for me to operate. And I have a lot of context, and my users actually didn't understand what I was doing. The first time somebody comes and takes 200 lines of code and adds in like a spaceship operator, a couple of arrows with squiggly lines, and some hierarchies, they're like, what did you do? I don't understand any of this. You had some knockout variables on like your hash, so you were like mixing and matching on their dev environments, and they're just like, no, put it back. So what we really had to do was we had to take a step back, do a little bit more education, talk to our users a little bit more about, hey, what problems do you really have? Because in some ways we'd solve problems they didn't have. They're like, no, I just wanted to add plugins to Jenkins. I didn't want you to fix Jenkins. Like we can. No, don't touch that. It's delicate. So asking them, like, what do you actually care about? And sometimes you do some refactoring for them. Like we're in the process of doing this Puppet 3 to 4, so I've been touching everybody's code. But most of the time, that's like underneath the covers. When you're dealing with what the users actually touch or how they manage their roles, you actually need to talk to them and be not careful, but just make sure they're on board with the changes you're going to be making. So now, office hours are really nice. People come in, they say, hey, I have this hat problem. We talk about it early. Sometimes you can't help them, and sometimes you can, but just the fact that they're willing to come to you and explain their problem, I think is really an advantage for the team. The other thing we do is we make some mistakes in public. Does everybody see this terrible amount of standard lib abuse? This never actually made it onto any servers, thank goodness. I believe several Puppet Labs employees made fun of it, as they should. And it was sort of the, why don't you just upgrade to Puppet 4, I think was a popular response to this. But it was fun, actually, for a lot of people at the company to see that, the stuff doesn't spring fully formed out of anybody's forehead. We have some missteps. We go down one path. Even within the team, my friend Trey Torrance, who's no longer with Twitter, I'd often come to his desk. I'm like, all right, I've got this idea. And then he looks back at me and he's like, I'm not going to like this, am I? And most of the time that was true. But by going through this process, we usually came up with something good. And it was important for people to see that we're not always the people telling you no in your code or fixing your code or changing a bunch of things. We do this to ourselves too. We iterate in public. We try and have these conversations. Sometimes I get to send postmortems about, hey, you know how I tried to make cert generation faster? Well, it turns out that over the course of 6 months, I iterated a race condition that happened 1 in 200,000 times, all the way down to now it happens 1 in 3 times. Sorry about that. And it's important for people to see, like, hey, sometimes we make mistakes. It turned out cert generation wasn't bad. Restarting your cert servers constantly was bad. But once we found the race condition and walked it all the way back, we realized, like, yeah, we had iterated this thing terribly and just weren't paying attention. And we need to tell people, like, this is what we did, and sorry. And, everybody's pretty cool, but it's, again, we're operating a real system that's user-facing, and we shouldn't hide these things from our user. The last thing you really want is things to get magically better and then not explain it. Because now that, like, people are, I don't know about those guys. And generally, making a mistake is okay as long as they're like, oh, okay, you made a mistake, you know what it was, you explained it, like, everything's working. And I agree with them. All right, last mini rant. Delete, 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 delete. We have source control. Just delete it. I never want to see it again. I'm tired of stuff sitting in the code base that's like, oh, we might need that again. No, you don't. Get rid of it. I never want to see, like, all of it. Not just like, oh, one place. Somebody will find it. They will copy the wrong thing. They just don't have the context. They will pick one thing that, like, oh, looks close. So one of the things that was amazingly helpful was just getting rid of all the terrible cases at Twitter. We don't have all of them gone, but like 90%. And like now when somebody copies some code, you're like, hey, do it this way. They probably picked the right example because it'd be really hard to find the wrong example. Occasionally I've seen it happen. Somebody had a branch sitting for like 6 months, and then they dig something out of it. I'm like, I got rid of that. Where did this come from? And then it turns out they've had a branch sitting around forever. But generally, I've occasionally had to go and dig something out. It's happened literally twice in 2 years. Like, just get rid of it. All right. So as the system gets better, this one was actually a weird one for me. As the system gets better, the quality of the problems goes down. Like, somebody typoed something, like, that's the biggest problem you had today, and you're kind of annoyed. You're like, oh, why are you bringing me typos? Like, you should have figured this out. But if, like, that's the worst thing you're dealing with all day, I will totally answer that. I won't answer that question all day. I got stuff to do. But, like, if that's the worst question I had to deal today, like, that's great. Sometimes it was really frustrating because you're like, why are you bringing me this nonsense? And even new employees are hilarious. I inherited a video engineer, and every time something went wrong in his video stack, he came to me, it's Puppet. And after about 2 weeks, I'm like, hey, how well did config management work at your last company? He's like, oh, it was always broken. I'm like, cool, that doesn't happen here. I'm like, more than often, the problem is your fault. But I'm like, I will look, we'll go through this together. But I'm like, this is not your last company. And like realizing like people have learned these behaviors based on what was happening wherever in their environment, like made me like, oh, I'm not angry about it. You're like not blaming me. You're just doing what worked at the last company. That's cool. I'm okay with that. But it took a little while to kind of reach that zen of like, users have problems that aren't really problems. Like, hey, I'm doing a good job. Yay. And actually, I couldn't find the graph. We wrote this hilarious graph one night at work of the longer you work on something, the more pride you have in it. And that works the same of whether it's great, and that works the same of whether the solution is terrible. The more time you spend on your terrible solution, the more you love it. And then you can't let it go. So what we try and do is we try and stop the terrible solution before it happens. Like you're going to do some big refactoring in Puppet, come talk to us. I see a bunch of commits go by, I'm going to come talk to you. I'm going to be like, people at work have called me some terrible version of Clippy that only cares about your Puppet code. Hey, looks like you're writing a feature. Can I help? And it's true. But it's really important to engage early of like, hey, what are you trying to do? I mean, like, and sometimes it's a super easy win of, that already exists. Like, here it is, you're done. And they're like, oh, great, and then off you go. Sometimes, like, they're writing something complicated. Sometimes they have a new daemon, so now we're in that mode of like, okay, I don't know anything about your daemon, so I throw some like terrible like install config service thing, and they're like, no, it doesn't work that way, and then we have to go back, and then I learn just enough about their daemon to help them automate it, and then they learn enough about Puppet to make sure it's kind of doing the right thing, and we kind of circle back, but as soon as we get in early, we almost never have any problems. And then job 1 was reducing context. Job 2 is help the user ship their code. I hate code that people have talked to me about, and then I don't see it for a month. I will come to your desk and go, where's that code? You put me on a review board, I said yes, and you have not shipped it. Why is it not in the repo? Like, I don't want your feature like sitting around, like waiting to be sprung on somebody, like, let's get it out the door. Biggest problem is people, even with their own feature that they need, have some safety concerns. We've run it, on test clusters, like it's usually something kind of trivial, but if the code is relatively complex, and they really don't understand the Puppet side, like once it's beyond like package stuff, like if we're doing interesting things in templates and stuff, they're like, well, your automated system is dynamic, and now something can go wrong. And while I agree with them in practice, like everything else in the box is dynamic too. Like if it goes, it's all going to go. It's not just going to be this new thing. So convincing them to like get this code out the door is sometimes a little bit of a battle. But most people have been somewhat surprised by our team of like, hey, you're going to ship that? They're like, oh, normally sysadmins hate change. They're like, no. Like, we're here for velocity in small chunks. I'm like, I don't want big chunks sitting around, or the worst thing ever is when you have to do the upgrade because you've been backed into a corner. I'm like, oh, we waited so long to do this. Now there's a CVE, and like, oh, and the deadline's next week, and now we absolutely have to ship it at this very moment, and all our plans of doing like a nice rollout are gone. It's literally the worst. So always trying to get people to ship it early, ship it now, ship it when they don't have to, and we like have options to roll it back or take another pass at it is great. The other thing is waiting on these changes like never does anything. I mean, like, so the longer we wait, the safer it's going to be. Cool. How does that work? Like, we're going to learn something, and maybe I'll see a blog post and it'll like tell me this is wrong. I'll meet Heinrich again. That's what'll happen. But like, the longer we wait here, like, anything change? Did the system get any better? Did you get any smarter? Did I get any smarter? Like, no. Like, we should just do it, and then learn something. I mean, certainly, if we're worried about it, we can like do a smaller rollout. We can do some more tests. But honestly, like, just waiting never seems to do anything for it. The other thing, lots of users tend to solve their own problem. Everybody has that rule of 3 of, okay, the third time you have to do it, generalize it. At a little bit of a larger scale, I find it's a little better to generalize early. I've definitely had arguments when I worked at a small company. I used to say things like premature generalization is the root of all evil. Sometimes you're like, I will never need this code. Working at a little bit larger scale, we probably generalize earlier than most people. It's still a little bit of a balancing act. Honestly, most of the time without 3 cases, I think you generalize in the wrong direction anyway. And we've certainly done some early generalization well, we've done it bad, and I would probably still wait for 3 cases most of the time. All right, so we talked a little bit about kind of what success didn't look like, and what success looks like. But if you actually had to measure some numbers, these are the numbers I actually think matter. And actually, I pulled some of our numbers. So 2 years ago, we were doing maybe about 30,000 commits a year, and we were writing a lot of code. And they were like usually fairly big changes. And then a year ago, commits had gone way down to maybe about 20,000 a year. And then this year, I think we're on track to hit 35,000, but which is mostly an interesting number if it's just getting bigger. But what we are seeing is those commits are getting a lot smaller. Most of the time, it's a one-line change of, hey, instead of needing to write 80 lines of code, I just need to add another line to this define, or I just need to call this define again with another title, or I need to add 1 bit of data to an array. And that's really what we want to see is people can manage their systems with the tools they already have. That scaffolding is already there, and they don't need to update it. So these interfaces are actually cluing us in, like the smaller commits clue us in that our interfaces are actually working in most cases. At least I think that's what it means. I mean, it sounds good, but we're still looking at it. The other thing is docs and tools usually mean more committers. If the system's not easy to work with, you're worried about breaking something, it's like hard to get your change in, you're probably not commit. You're gonna make the one person on your team who did the Puppet thing once do the commit. As soon as it's easy, it gets spread out to more people on the team, and they'll just make their minor changes here and there. And we are seeing that. That number has not crept up much. It's probably more like we went from 130 rolling average to about 150. But generally, I think we're headed in the right direction there based on those numbers. Cool. Well, I finished, I got 10 minutes to play around with. Happy to answer questions. And if you are the expert at something, your coworkers will totally meme you. So there you go. So any questions? I think somebody's got a microphone.
Yeah, sure. So the mic's over here. Raise your hand. I'll run round, ask the question. And I think we've got time for quite a few. So let's see a show of hands.
If not, happy to. Yeah. If not, happy to hang out outside. Or
yeah, just a question. How do you deal with client-side adoption of things like syntax fixes?
How do I deal with client-side adoptions of syntax
so
fixes?
Specifically, you can install server-side Git hooks and things, but how do you persuade people to embrace the love of that on their own desktop machines before they push anything?
I haven't been, we haven't pushed that really hard, and I haven't been very successful at it. Generally, what we've done is we enforce server-side, and then eventually people get a little bit frustrated with like having this longer feedback loop. And we do have it documented. It's very easy to install the server or all the client-side tools. I have it built into my environment. I kind of use my environment as sort of the documented case for everybody. Assuming you use Vim, and then we have stuff for like Emacs and other things. But generally, most of the users probably don't use it. They commit to the master, and then they get bounced back. Like we just rejected a commit based on Puppet Lint and a bunch of other things, and then they fix it. If they are doing it a little bit more often, usually they'll install the client tools or the client environment. But generally, I haven't pushed on it hard, and I don't think users really want it until they start feeling the pain. One thing I was surprised was we actually only turned on server-side hooks this year, really started enforcing Puppet Lint. A lot of it was we had such an old code base that went back to 2007 that there was just so much in there, and certain things people were just never going to fix on their own. So after we did like a bunch of Puppet Lint passes, we started enforcing that. And I was actually very surprised that people were happy. They're like, oh, I get feedback right away and I don't have to talk to anybody, and like it basically tells me what to do and what line number. Yeah, it was like I was a week in and like, oh, I was expecting a tiny bit of grumbling, and it actually went really well. That kind of answer? Or, yeah.
Okay, one more over here.
Cheers. Hey, this might be an impossible question given the time we have, but how do you handle hire data for, like, collaborative hire data in an organization as big as yours?
Sure. So up until now, we haven't, and that's a decision we've occasionally revisited the last 2 years. So when we came into Twitter, we're basically Puppet 2, and we have our own ENC called Audubon because we like bird puns. And what do you call it? So Audubon is sort of this key value store that you can return data, and you can set it at the role level, you can set it at the host level, and sort of data center level, and this kind of stuff. And generally, like as long as you're looking for like key value string, everything's good. It doesn't do structured data, and it doesn't do data types. So we looked at doing Hira 3 and or Hira in Puppet 3. But what I didn't want to end up with was a 150 level of Hira hierarchy. I just thought it was going to be untenable. And people were going to probably pick conflicting names, and like it was just going to be, and I really didn't have any good ideas. So what we decided to do was do the Puppet 4 update, move to in-module data, so that way people could actually have their own private hierarchy within their cluster, and that was going to be the way forward. So that's the plan, but I can't say I know anything because we haven't implemented it fully yet. Sure.
Who approves commits to master?
Really, so we can control it at the module level. So generally, our team can commit to anything. Though if I touch your module, I will usually try and get a review from you. If it's something simple, I usually won't tell you. I renamed all your variables. It's awesome. So, yeah. But if I'm going to mess with your logic, I will usually come talk to you. And then on the other hand, like you can commit within your own module. You can touch a fair amount. Like certain teams can touch a lot more than others. Like OS team sort of has sort of carte blanche. We're the core infrastructure team. Very few things are actually locked down. Generally, I try not to lock down too much. I lock down modules when I want to deprecate them, so people can't use them, and that actually seems to work relatively well. Occasionally, it's a problem when people are like, "No, I wanted to deprecate, and I'm not allowed to like remove it from the module anymore." I'm like, oh, "I'll go in and fix it." What I might say is we try and optimize for users that are trying to do the right thing. And we've definitely put some in, some guardrails, but I don't worry too much about the pathological case. And generally that's worked out, but that might not work in your environment.
So when are you guys going to Puppet 5? How's the upgrade to Puppet 4 going, and when did you start?
So we started Puppet 4 seriously probably about February. And we have about 125,000 lines of custom written manifest code. And it was just big. People never wrote a lot of interfaces, so there was a lot of use of dynamic variables. Like people would throw a bunch of variables around, and so I thought I got them all in Puppet 2. And then, so we're in Puppet 3, great. We go to Puppet 4, and I'm like, why is Apache vhost missing all these variables? People are declaring them in the role, then they call a define, and they're not getting passed through the define. That was probably 50% of the cases, but there were like over 3,000 or 4,000 cases. Also, we had punted a little bit on some of the Puppet 3. We didn't move everything to its own file. And probably the stickiest ones in Puppet 4 were just the type cases of where undef is no longer undef in certain cases. Those were probably the hardest. Otherwise, it was stuff like I used range to generate a bunch of array of numbers, and now I pass those numbers in a title, and Puppet 4 is like only strings for titles, put these integers away. I documented a little bit of this on Ask Puppet. I was like, hey, I have a large code base. I'm going from 3 to 4. So we wrote terrible things called num to string, string to num. And we had some custom attributes, so there's like regular attribute, and then if you want to return undef, there's attribute underscore undef, because I couldn't figure out how to pass an undef back through that wasn't getting munged through empty string and then back out to something else. So generally, it wasn't bad. I've heard 4 to 5 is much, much easier, but we're probably like a couple weeks away from throwing the switch.
Okay, I think we have one more.
Do you have any really good strategies you like for preventing unexpected changes in production, like no-op runs, or I've seen modules like Octacatalog to detect changes before they go out after you merge into your repo?
Yeah, mostly testing in stage, or like what we call head. It's sort of like a strategy, defense in depth, depending on what you're trying to do. One of the probably the hardest thing we've had to deal with is we had a bunch of very large modules, like something ridiculous called default packages, which is like 1,000 lines and includes 4 distros worth of if statements. And so you unpack all that, and then you actually have to figure out, like, did you lose any packages? So in those cases, yeah, we were using catalog diff. Also, yeah, I was making sure that like resources text still looked the same on both, or still at least contained those things. I wouldn't say we have anything well done automated, and after Puppet 4, we'll probably try and go down the more, really look at testing and kind of talk about, okay, where are we and how do we get to state of the art? So I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question for you. Is maybe the right answer.
Any final questions? Right, big hand for Ramin. Thank you, Ramin.
Thank you.